Hey, what's up, you guys? It's Issa with Journey to Programming. Today, we're going to begin a C# tutorial series, and we're going to begin with this video, which is video number 1 of the series, to learn about variables and data types. So I've already got Visual Studio open here. Let me go ahead and switch to that for you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project for this series. So let me go ahead and make a console application. So if you're following me, you guys can go ahead and do the same. I'm going to name it C# tutorial series. And then I'm going to go ahead and keep it as a console app and hit OK. I don't need it to create a Git repository, so I'll go ahead and remove that. I'll let it create a directory for the solution, no problem, and I'll keep it on .NET Framework 4.61. That should be fine. And there we go. So it should automatically create a project for you and a solution, and then it should open up the program.cs, which has your main function in it. Okay, so like I said, we're going to begin with a really introductory lesson here. We're going to talk about variables and data types. So when we think about variables and data types, we think about numbers, writing words or sentences, which are strings, decimal point numbers, which would be floats or doubles, etc., and objects, stuff like that. So let's go ahead and begin with just kind of giving you guys a few examples here. And I'll go ahead and add them into a comment format. So, like I just said, we have int, we have string, and I'm going to add another example here. So int stands for integers. So like a number 1, double. These are usually floating point numbers or decimals. So an example of this would be, let's say, 2.4. Float, same as double for the most part, floating point number or decimals. And let's say like 4.565. There we go. String, if we want to write a string like, hey, I'm Issa, and I'm the one teaching this tutorial. All right, and then let's say char, which stands for character. And an example would be the letter A. Okay, and then there's a few other types out there which you may end up needing, but I'm not going to elaborate on them yet. And what I'm talking about are when you start getting into like structures and stuff like that. Those act as their own data type to an extent, but let's ignore that for now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you guys how you declare some of these in C#, and then I want you guys to follow along as we continue declaring variables and then printing them out onto the command line, all right, or into the console, sorry. So you'll see down below, I'm going to open up a console window here, and that way we can see what our output's going to be. But first of all, let's go ahead and begin declaring some of these variables. So I'm going to begin with ints. Ints stand for integers, and I'm going to define a few. So let's say int, and let's give it a variable name. So let's say int day of the month is equal to the 23rd. So today is February 23rd, 2020, and I'm currently defining a variable called day of the month. And I'm making that variable the type of integer. All right. So that's how you would actually read this line of code right here. And I'm setting this variable, which has to be an integer because I've declared it of that type, to be equal to 23. So you may be saying, okay, well, why did I make the variable name so long when I could have just declared it as int x is equal to 23? Well, as you develop your skills in software development and continue your studies in computer science, you're going to learn that one of the best ways to make your code more readable and clean is to provide readable variable names that make sense in terms of the context of what you're doing. So I called this the day of the month, and I defined it to 23 because today is the 23rd of February, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out this integer as the day of the month. Okay, so in order to show you guys how to print this and actually get some output of printing an integer, let's go ahead and write the console command so that we can write this to it. So printing is a very common way to, let's see, test objects or test variables to see that they contain the data that you thought they did. And then also, if you're writing code, to test throughout your code to see if when you're manipulating data, that data's staying or changing the way you want it to. In this case, we're just going to print out day of the month. And if I save this and then I go to build solution, it's going to compile. So first thing I do is save. So I could go save program or save all in this case. I had already done it with the keyboard kind of commands. You can see it's Control S and Control Shift S, kind of like most of other software. But after you do that, go to build solution. You're going to see that the compiler is running down here. You've got some output. We have a build. It succeeded. No failures. That's great. Now, what I want to do is I want to run this code. And what I expect to happen when I run this, I expect down here in my output window to see 23 printed out. So let's go ahead and start our application. So let's continue on here. I had a little hiccup there, but let's continue. So you've saved, and now let's go ahead and run build solution. Should say success, and it's already up to date because I already built it before that hiccup occurred. But now we want to run our software. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up to, if you see here, there's a start. If you run this as just start, a console window will pop up, but then it will close automatically because there's no breakpoints in your code right now. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to go to debug, and we're going to go start without debugging, which the hotkey would be Control F5. And when we do this, it's going to go ahead and pop open a console window like you see here. And you can see that my output is 23, which is what was expected. So going back to our code, what we've done is we've defined an integer. We've defined the variable name as day of the month, and we've set that variable equal to 23, and then we've printed it out here. Okay, so now what we need to do is we want to close our console window because it's no longer needed, and we're going to go back to our code. So what I want to do is I want to challenge you guys here to think about how would we use the variable data types that I've defined up here to now print out the day of the month as a whole date. So I want to print out today is, and then we could say 2/23/2020 or whatever day it is by you. And I want to go ahead and define that like we have here by defining some ints, and then I want to maybe use other variables and data types to define the remainder of that information we're going to define. So take a few minutes here to think about that. If you want, go ahead and pause now and think about it. So hopefully you guys were able to figure that out and or get an idea for what we're going to do. But now we're actually going to work through it. So what I've already defined is the day of the month as 23. So maybe what we could do to define the month because we know it's also an integer because it's 2, February. So what we could do is maybe define that as an int above day of the month. So we could say month is equal to 2. And then maybe we could define the year as an integer as well and define that to be 2020. All right, you guys may be seeing these green squigglies here, which are just because it's the nice IntelliSense in Visual Studio showing you that this variable is not being used. You can ignore that for now. Don't worry about it. Let me go ahead and hide this window so you guys could see the code a little more clearly. So now what we've done is we've defined 3 variables. We have a variable called month, day of the month, and year. And all of those are of the data type int. They've been assigned values as well. To assign the value, we use the equal sign. All right. So one thing we could do right now is we could print out all 3 of these on a line. So one way to do that is we could do month. So we're going to write line, which prints out a line in the output window or the console window. And we could say write line month plus day of the month plus year. So what this is doing is it's writing out the month variable plus the day of the month variable plus the year variable. So if we save this and then we go ahead and rebuild our solution, the other option is you could build just this piece of code here, but I'm going to go and just build the solution because it's going to only build the things that are changed or the source code that's changed. And then we go ahead and run this now. Again, run it without debugging so that console window stays open. Then what we're going to see is the following. So we see that the value is 2045. Let me zoom it in so you can read it. So why'd that happen? What do you guys think? So when we tried to print this, let me make sure that console window is still showing up. When we tried to print this, we said console.writeLine, which just is a command to write or print this information out that's within these parentheses to the console window, which is this window here. And what we did is we said print out month plus day of the month plus year. Well, because all 3 of these variables are integers, what ended up happening here is it added them together and then it printed out the sum of these 3 variables because they're integers. So if these were strings, the plus symbol would just append a string to one another. But in this case, it added them all together, which is why we have our output as 2045, which is the sum of 2 plus 23, which is 25, plus 2020, so you have 2045. So how could we maybe change that so that it prints each one separately? Well, there is another console.write command, which the difference between write and write line is write line prints out a new line when you use it, versus write will print out just on that line itself. So what would happen if we said write month, and then we did this again, and we did it once per variable. Let's take a look. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and comment out using these slashes here the old print or console.writeLine statement we used. And now I'm going to rebuild. So I'll rebuild this solution, and I'm going to go ahead and run it the way I showed you guys. So now if you look, what we see is, okay, we've printed out what looks like each of the variables, and the exit prompt is showing up on the same line as well. But you can at least see that you have each one of the variables here now. So 2 is your month. That's the first thing we printed out on the line. And then you have the day of the year, which is 23, or the day of the month, sorry. And then you have the year, which is 2020. Great. So we actually have our output printing out individually. Now, it's a little confusing the way it is, but it makes sense. So one thing we could do here to fix that and make sure that, first of all, there's a separation on the line between the exit prompt here, which is press any key to continue. We could make the last statement, which is year, right line, but that's going to do something weird here. Okay, what this is going to do is it's going to write the year one line below 2 and then 23. So it'll say 223. You'll have a return carriage or a new line, and then on that next line, I'll say 2020. So maybe we don't want to do that. How could we go about making this so it writes them all on the same line, and then there's an extra line afterwards so that the statement for kind of closing that terminal window or that command window is on its own line? I'll let you guys think about that for a second. Go ahead and pause the video and try on your own. All right, so coming back here, I think that something we could possibly do is uncomment this last right line statement and just print it out empty, okay? So by doing this, what we're doing is we're printing the month, day of the month, and year all on the same line. And you know what? I'm going to shorten this because all of these are related to the same context, month, day, and year, to just day, just to simplify that variable name. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and rebuild our solution and test this. So if I go to debug, start without debugging, if you take a look now, it seems like we've printed it out the way we want. So we have 2, which is the month, we have 23, which is the day, and 2020, which is the year, all on one line. And then the last right line, which has nothing in its parentheses, is just making a return carriage occur before the exit prompt shows up in that command window, okay? So let's continue on here. I'm going to close this terminal window or this console window, and I have a few others running here. Let me close them. And let's continue on with the rest of learning here. The rest of the learning, how the variables and the data types work. So right now we've defined today by making 3 variables that are ints, and we made a month, day, and year. How can we do this using a string, okay? And I'm going to let you guys think about this by looking at this line up here and looking at how we've defined an int and trying on your own. So go ahead and pause here and give it a shot. All right, so let's go ahead and continue. So one way to do this is we can define a string by stating the variable type, giving it a variable name, or sorry, the data type, and then giving it a variable name, and let's say today's date. And what we could do is we could set this equal to 2/23/2020. So a string can be alphanumeric, and it can also contain symbols and basically anything within ASCII, all right? There's a bit more to that, but let's just go ahead and imagine we're just using an ASCII set. If you guys are curious, look it up. There's a lot more that's available in Unicode, but we're not going to go into that right now. So let's continue on here. So now what we've done is we've defined a string. We've called the variable today's date, which is relevant to our context here. So we've assigned it a string, which is enclosed by these quotes, which is today's date. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a console.writeLine. And this time I'm going to print out today's date, which is our variable, which is a string. And let's go ahead and see what happens now. So if I go to build, I go to debug and go to start without debugging, you could see that my string printed out directly to the console. Wow, that's a pretty simple way to do it. It's not very dynamic because it's a hard-coded string, but that was a really easy way to do what's showing up here and do it in a nicely formatted way, okay? So let's go ahead and close this. This is how you can define a string. Let's go ahead and show you guys maybe how a double works and as an example, okay? So a double and a float, these are decimal point numbers. So let's go ahead and define a double, and let's say minimum wage is equal to, I don't even know what minimum wage is equal to right now, especially in California, but let's say it's equal to $13.25, all right? So what we've done is we've defined a data type double, or a variable called min wage, which is of the data type double, which allows it to be a decimal point number, and we've assigned it the value of 13.25. We could do similar using a float, okay? And what we can do is we can define this one as f min wage, f being float, is equal to 13.25, semicolon. Now you're going to see that there's an error here, red squigglies, bad sign. And what this is looking for is it's looking for an F after the definition of the number, which signifies that this is a float, okay? In C#, when it sees a decimal point number, it usually wants to go ahead and make it a double. But in this case, we add the F on the end to make it the compiler understand that this is a floating point number. Either one works. A lot of people use doubles because it doesn't require you to add the F, but there are some cases where you will use a float instead of a double. You'll figure that out later on. Don't worry about it. Either one works for now. So what we've done is we've defined minimum wage in two different ways. These are two variables, and each one has a different data type. One is a double, one is a float. Both of them are equal to the same number, okay? So one thing I want to challenge you guys to do is I want you to experiment with this. What would happen if you tried to maybe assign this integer month with a floating point number? I think you guys should go ahead and try that and see what happens. The compiler may not let you. It may let you. We'll see. I'll let you guys experiment. So go ahead and take a little break right now and try it on your own. All right, so if we go up to our month variable here and I try to make it a decimal number. So let's say it's int 2.5, or int month is equal to 2.5. Well, you automatically get the red squigglies. And then you can see here under the red squigglies, it's giving you a little bit of a nice kind of warning or heads up here that we cannot implicitly convert from double to int. All right, an explicit conversion exists. Are you missing a cast? So this 2.5, like I said, is a double in the eyes of C#. Okay, it wants to be a double, but you're trying to assign it to an int or a variable that is an int. So there is an error here. You cannot go ahead and just make it an F and expect it to work. No, F stands for floating, so you cannot do that. You could potentially cast this. So if you cast it, you can cast it as an int. And what this is going to do is when it compiles, it's going to go ahead and say, okay, this is a double, but I want it to be represented as an int. So let's go ahead and cut off the precision. And then it's going to leave you with just probably the 2. So we can go ahead and confirm that and see what happens here if we go ahead and run our program as it is, and then we try to read what this output is in our console. All right, so if I go ahead and build this, go to Start Without Debugging, and I view our console window, you will see that we only see a 2 up here. So this is equal to this line here, and it's printing out month. So this cast here cut off the 0.5. If you know you're going to be using an int, don't throw a decimal number in there and cast it. There's no need. It's extra overhead. It's unnecessary. So I would avoid doing that. But that's an example of what will happen if you try to assign a float or a decimal point number to a int. All right. So continuing on, another data type that I've shown you guys up there is char. So let's say that chars are always a single character. So I'm going to say char C is equal to A, all right? Or better yet, let me make this more relevant. Let's say first name initial. So char first name initial, this is the variable name, is equal to the character E. So my name is Isa. The first letter of my name is an E. Therefore, I've assigned E to this variable, all right? And now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and wrap up this lesson by showing you guys that you can print out each one of these using a console.write and the various ways we can combine them within a write command, all right? So what I'm going to show you first is just the printing of maybe all of these in one line. And then I'm going to give you guys a challenge to do on your own. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out month, plus, let's say a comma between that, and then let's go the day, and then another comma. Actually, let me make these commas strings, and you guys are probably wondering what I'm doing right here. Plus year, plus, let's go ahead and give us another comma, plus today's date, plus another comma to separate things, min wage, another comma to separate it, F min wage, and then lastly, first name initial. So that is a really long line right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and separate it a little bit by adding a carriage return between this command here. So that's a little more easily readable. So we have console.write line, it's going to print month. And then you probably are wondering what this does here. So what this does is, as I mentioned earlier, having a plus symbol between strings, which ultimately, another hiccup there, but let's jump right back in. So like I mentioned, when you print something out, when you use that plus symbol between two strings, it appends them to each other. So although month is an int data type, that variable is an int, when it's printed out alone, like it is here, it gets converted into a string when it gets written out to the console. Because it does not have an int on the other side of this plus operator, it is going to go ahead and convert this to a string. And then because the other side of the operator is a string, it's going to append it to it. So what we should see here is the month, which is the number 2 as a string, and then a comma and a space, and then another int, which is converted to a string, which is today, the day, which is number 23, comma, space, 2020, comma, space, our string version of today's date, which is 2/23/2020, comma, space, our first declaration of min wage, which is 13.25, comma, space, our second declaration of 13.25, and you're going to see that the F will not print out with it. Okay, it is just the number, comma, space, and then my first initial, which we defined here as lowercase e. So let's go ahead and build this. Okay, we have 1 success, no failures, and then let's go ahead and run it with a start without debugging. I'm going to use the shortcut Control F5, and what we can see here is this is our first series of console.writes, which we defined here. And that return carriage, which is this write line here, leads us into this console.write line, which is today's date, which we defined as a string. And then it leads us into our final write line, which is 2, which is our month, comma, space, 23, the year, our string format year, min wage in 2 forms, and then my initial. End it off here. And then we are done, all right? So that is a quick example of variables and data types in C#. I hope you guys learned a lot. I do have a challenge for you guys now. So one thing I would like you guys to do is I would like you to define a couple new variables. I want a variable that makes this look a little bit more clean. So I'm thinking that you should define a variable that is going to say today's date is colon, and then after that you should maybe print out today's date appended to that string in both written format. So you should have February 23rd, 2020 written out, and then separate it however you'd like. And I'd like you guys to do that challenge and go ahead and comment with your ultimate output in the comments down below. If you have any questions, feel free to post them below, and we will try to get back to you as soon as possible. Don't forget to subscribe. Have a good one, you guys.